The sound of a brass band blaring outside my window at 6 in the morning wasn't exactly what I expected to wake up to on a quiet Saturday. At first, I thought I was dreaming, maybe some bizarre leftover echo from the movie I watched the night before. But then came the high-pitched screech of a microphone feedback loop, followed by a woman's voice screaming something about peonies and linen placements. I rolled over in bed, squinting at the sunlight pouring in through the blinds. The noise wasn't fading, it was getting louder. That was when I dragged myself to the window, pulled back the curtain, and saw a sight that nearly made me choke on my own tongue. A full-blown wedding setup. On my lawn. White chairs in symmetrical rows. A flower-covered archway right next to my pond. Giant catering tents lined up like a military formation. And strangers. Dozens of them. Laughing, shouting, rearranging things like it was the most normal event in the world. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. It was still there. I live on a rural property surrounded by trees and fields. My nearest neighbor is half a mile down the road. The only people who have permission to step on my lawn are the helicopter pilots who lease it for landings. And maybe my mailman, if he's feeling bold. I stormed outside barefoot in plaid pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, stomping across the dew-soaked grass toward the chaos. A woman in a silk robe turned toward me, perfectly curled blonde hair and a smile that could curdle milk. "Oh good, you're here," she said like I was a long-lost friend. "Don't worry, we'll clean up everything after the ceremony." I stopped in my tracks. "Excuse me, who are you, and what are you doing on my land?" She blinked, genuinely confused, and said, "I'm Karen. I'm the bride. This is our wedding venue." I laughed. Out loud. I looked around for hidden cameras. Surely this was some prank. A TikTok stunt. But no one laughed with me. Instead, Karen frowned. "Our planner said this field was community-used land. You weren't using it. So we figured it wouldn't be a big deal." A man walked by holding a tray of shrimp cocktail. Someone else adjusted the wedding arch. A group of groomsmen were playing hacky sack in front of my tool shed. I stood there, still waiting for someone, anyone, to say just kidding. But Karen was already calling out instructions to her bridesmaid. My blood pressure skyrocketed. "You didn't get permission to be here. This is private property." Her tone changed. "Well, we're already set up and guests are arriving. It would be a shame to ruin my big day over a little patch of grass." A little patch of grass. It was 3 acres. And not just grass. It was FAA-designated helicopter landing territory. I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound beat me to it. A low rhythmic thumping in the distance. At first faint, then unmistakable. The rotors. Oh no. Oh yes. Right on schedule. A Bell 407 came into view over the tree line, flying low and fast. Guests looked up, confused. Karen turned around and screamed. The tent walls flapped violently as the chopper approached, and by the time it began descending into the field, exactly where her dance floor was laid out, people were running in all directions. Tablecloths ripped from their clips. Hair extensions flew. The arch tipped sideways. I calmly stepped back onto my porch, crossed my arms, and watched the chaos unfold. The pilot hovered just above the grass, and then touched down with a whoosh of displaced air and dust. A bridesmaid lost her heel, and went skidding across the field like a hockey puck. Karen grabbed the edge of a table for balance, shouting for someone to stop the madness. She screamed up at the cockpit, demanding the helicopter leave. But that's not how leases work. I rent that portion of my land to a helicopter company for tourism rides and pilot training. Saturdays are booked for landings every hour on the hour. This wasn't just a fluke. It was just beginning. Karen stormed back up to my porch, makeup running and veil wrapped around her neck like a scarf. "You have to make them stop," she shouted. "Call them off." I told her plainly I can't. They pay for this space. You don't. She looked at me like I'd grown horns. "I will call the police," she threatened. "Fantastic," I said with a grin. "Let's clear this up legally." She dialed with trembling fingers while guests hid behind catering trucks and tried to rescue a mangled wedding cake from a tip table. 10 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled into the driveway. I handed over my paperwork, FAA permits, lease agreements, and copies of email correspondence with the helicopter company. Karen, meanwhile, could only offer a shaky claim that a wedding planner told her the field was open for use. The officer stared at her in disbelief. "You didn't get written permission, no, but I was told, ma'am, this is trespassing. You can't just show up on someone's property and host a wedding because it looks nice." Karen began to cry, but it wasn't sadness. It was frustration. A full-blown tantrum. She kept saying this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, that I was deliberately ruining it. I pointed to the sign nailed to the fence. Private property, no trespassing, FAA-approved airspace. She tried to say it wasn't visible because of the flower garlands her team had wrapped around it. "You covered the warning sign and are now shocked by what's happening?" I asked. "You built a wedding on an active helicopter landing site." She stomped off, veil flapping behind her like a torn sail. The sheriff gave me a nod, clearly amused and mildly impressed. He told Karen she and her guests had 30 minutes to vacate before citations would be issued. She turned beet red and hissed under her breath. As the chopper lifted off again, sending another gust of wind through the remains of her shattered centerpieces, I turned to the deputy and said, "Sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms. Sometimes it just flies in on schedule." The officer laughed all the way back to his cruiser. The guests trickled out. Vendors packed up in a huff. Karen disappeared behind the wheel of a BMW with rust-stained lace dragging from the trunk. And I stood in the exact spot where the altar had been, looking up as another helicopter approached in the distance. They wanted drama. They got wind, noise, embarrassment, and a very public eviction. And I wasn't even out of pajamas yet. By the time the first helicopter had lifted off and left behind a trail of ruined centerpieces, blown-over chairs, and a shattered wedding cake that looked like it had survived a small tornado, the remaining guests stood around in disbelief, half of them shielding their eyes from the dust, the other half filming the aftermath on their phones. The bride had retreated somewhere, probably inside her car to sob or scream or both, and the groom, who had been surprisingly silent during the entire first encounter, shuffled awkwardly toward me like a man trying to walk barefoot across broken glass. I was back on my porch sipping coffee now, calmer than before but still very much entertained. He cleared his throat and said in a low voice that was barely audible over the wind, "Look, man, this has been a mess. I didn't know we didn't have permission. I thought Karen had it all squared away." I stared at him for a long moment. Either he was genuinely clueless or he was trying to soften me up so they could buy a few more hours on my land before the next chopper came in and turned their wedding into a propeller-powered horror movie again. Either way, it didn't matter. I told him the land was under contract every Saturday from noon to sundown and that there were 4 more helicopters scheduled to land and take off. If they were hoping for a peaceful sunset ceremony, they had picked the worst venue on the continent. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the scattered crowd and started talking to people, though I couldn't hear what he said. What I did hear was the steady thump of another chopper in the distance. Right on time. Guests began panicking again, shielding drinks and ducking under tent poles. A small child cried while clutching a bouquet like it was a life preserver. One elderly aunt tripped over a microphone cord and fell into a chair that collapsed under her. The second helicopter swooped low, landed a few yards from the smoldering remnants of what had been their dance floor, and blew a gust of hot air across the entire area like the universe had hit a giant hairdryer set to maximum chaos. A few of the guests fled to the parking area, climbed into cars, and just drove away, abandoning the rest of the spectacle like it was a cursed event. The photographer, who had been trying to capture posed couple shots next to the floral arch, gave up completely and started filming the madness like he was shooting a documentary titled Disaster at Noon. Karen reappeared minutes later with her hair ruined, lipstick smeared, and her veil now tangled around her waist. She marched up to the edge of my porch like a woman possessed and demanded I call off the next helicopter. "You've made your point," she said through gritted teeth. "Can you please stop ruining my day?" I leaned forward and replied slowly. "These helicopters pay me to land here. You didn't. And you weren't invited." Her eyes blazed with fury, but before she could respond, the groom cut in and asked if we could just make a deal. I asked what kind of deal he had in mind. Karen looked hopeful. He said maybe I could delay the flights until the ceremony ended. Just a short window, an hour at most. He even offered to give me a couple $100 for the trouble. I almost laughed. I told him that even if I wanted to cancel a flight, I couldn't. The FAA clearance was time-locked, the company had paying customers, and these pilots were on a tight schedule. Besides, canceling would cost me more than a few $100s. Karen looked like she was about to explode again, but instead, she pulled out her phone and started frantically calling someone. Moments later, she was talking to the police again, this time screaming into the phone that there were rogue helicopters terrorizing her wedding. While she was mid-rant, I walked a few steps away and called the helicopter company manager, letting him know about the situation. He laughed when I told him. He said his pilots had already radioed in the report. They were loving the action. Apparently, one of them even offered a guest a ride and the guy accepted, just to escape the madness. That gave me an idea. I asked if we could offer short joyrides to guests, free of charge. The manager was surprisingly enthusiastic. Said it'd be great PR and a hilarious way to defuse the tension. I turned back to the crowd and announced the offer. Anyone who wanted a short helicopter ride was welcome to take one as long as they agreed to leave the property right after. Within seconds, half the guests raised their hand. Karen screamed. Her voice cracked. "No one is leaving my wedding for a helicopter ride. This is my day." But no one listened. People were tired, sweaty, and covered in dust. An exciting helicopter ride sounded way better than watching a meltdown in real time. One by one, guests lined up, took turns strapping in, and lifted off into the sky, waving down at the bride as she stood with her fists clenched and eyes burning with humiliation. Even the DJ packed up his gear early and caught a ride. Karen stood alone in the middle of the field, her dress now resembling a wrinkled curtain, her makeup melted into chaos, watching as her guests laughed and soared away in helicopters from what had become the most surreal wedding disaster anyone had ever witnessed. At some point during the commotion, a woman approached me quietly and said she was the wedding planner. She looked nervous and asked if she could talk. I invited her onto the porch, where she immediately apologized for everything. She said she'd been hired by Karen only 3 days prior, given no contracts, and told the lawn was already approved. She claimed Karen had refused to pay the deposit in advance and wanted to settle up after the event. The planner had tried to verify the venue but couldn't get clear answers. She knew something felt off but was desperate for work. Now, after witnessing this circus, she said she was walking away. She even handed me the clipboard she'd been carrying, which showed her communications with Karen, including messages where Karen admitted she didn't have permission and would deal with the owner later. I took photos of everything. Evidence. As the field began to empty, the third chopper buzzed in, spraying whatever tablecloths were still clinging to chairs across the yard like tumbleweed. Karen screamed again, louder this time, then did something unbelievable. She picked up her bouquet and hurled it at the helicopter. It didn't come close, obviously, but the pilot saw it and reported it immediately. That crossed the line. Interfering with an aircraft isn't just dumb, it's illegal. When the sheriff returned a few minutes later after receiving the follow-up call, he wasn't smiling anymore. He issued Karen a citation on the spot. She argued, wailed, threatened legal action, but it didn't matter. I stood off to the side as it all played out, sipping my now cold coffee with a small satisfied smile. The fourth helicopter came in just as the cop car pulled away, sending one final gust of wind to scatter what remained of the reception. The tent buckled. The DJ's tablecloth finally gave up. Karen let out one last guttural shriek, the sound of a person whose entitled world had crashed harder than her cake. I didn't say a word. I just watched the rotor blades slice through the air as the last few guests left behind what would surely be the most unforgettable wedding they'd ever attend. The next morning, I thought maybe the madness would be over, that Karen and her wedding nightmare would be nothing more than a story I could tell over coffee for the next decade. I figured she had slunk away, humiliated and hopefully enlightened. But no. As I walked outside to inspect the damage, I found a printed notice taped to my fence in pink glittery ink that read cease and desist property harassment pending legal action. I blinked, half expecting it to dissolve in the sunlight like a bad hallucination, but no, this was real. Underneath it was Karen's full name and a printed email threatening to sue for emotional distress, loss of ceremony memories, and the quote malicious destruction of marital celebration. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my mug. Apparently, Karen thought she had a legal case against me for having helicopters land on my own leased property during her unauthorized event. It was delusion at a scale I hadn't encountered since the town hall tried to ban roosters for crowing too early. I took down the paper, walked inside, and called my lawyer friend Amy. She answered on the second ring with her usual sarcastic tone, and listened quietly as I read her the letter. After a brief pause, she burst into a laugh so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. When she calmed down, she told me to gather every bit of documentation I had and send it to her. She sounded almost excited. Amy loved a good entitled meltdown almost as much as she loved courtroom victories. I spent the next hour organizing every piece of evidence: the helicopter lease, the FAA documents, the time-stamped texts from the wedding planner, and my own photos and videos. I also included a recording I had made with my phone of Karen threatening to sue me while screaming about her ruined dress in the middle of the field. Amy said I'd already won and I hadn't even been sued yet. But Karen wasn't done. That same day, she posted on her social media a long, dramatic paragraph about how a cruel local man had intentionally destroyed her wedding and endangered her guests with low-flying helicopters. She claimed the whole thing was a vendetta because she once rejected his romantic advances at a charity event. I nearly spit out my tea when I read that. I had never met Karen before that day. Ever. But internet lies are like wildfire, quick to spread, even quicker to get out of control. Within a few hours, the post had hundreds of comments. At first, it seemed like people believed her. A few posted messages of sympathy, but then the tide began to turn. Someone posted a drone video. The drone Karen had hired to film her wedding had apparently kept recording long after the chaos began, capturing everything from the moment the first chopper descended to the second she threw her bouquet at it. The video was brutal and beautiful, perfectly framed chaos in 4K. It went viral within hours, with titles like Bridezilla takes on Air Force and helicopter wedding fail turns into dust storm disaster. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. People paused the video and pointed out the no trespassing sign she covered in roses, the guests laughing as they left in helicopters, and even the moment Karen tried to kick over a cake table while screaming into a void. Her narrative collapsed under the weight of actual footage. The internet did what the internet does best. Turned her into a meme. There were remixes of her screaming matched to dubstep drop. Someone made a gif of her veil flying like a ghost over the grass. Her name started trending for all the wrong reasons. Karen tried to double down. She posted another video crying in her car, begging people to understand that it was her special day and that she'd been ambushed. But people had already decided. One particularly creative comment said it best. "Lady, you didn't get married, you got airlifted out of your own delusion." But what sealed the deal wasn't just the ridicule. It was the response from the vendors. The caterer posted screenshots of unpaid invoices and texts showing Karen had promised to pay after the event with money she said she was inheriting. The DJ posted a clip of the wedding planner screaming into the wind that she wasn't responsible for any of it. Even the florist chimed in, saying she'd filed a small claims suit against Karen for damage to her rented flower stands. As more truth poured in, Karen's posts started disappearing. First the wedding photos, then the angry rants, then the crying video. Within 2 days, she had set her profiles to private. But it didn't matter. The story had already taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, I received an email from Karen's lawyer. It was laughable. A vague threat of a lawsuit, no mention of trespassing, only buzzwords like emotional sabotage and negligent celebration destruction. Amy crafted a response that was professional but devastating. It included all our evidence and a counter-demand for restitution, repairs to the lawn, flight delays caused by the interference, and the cost of cleanup. It came out to over $30,000. I signed it with a flourish and sent it back. Within 24 hours, Karen's lawyer dropped all further communication. They knew they had nothing. I thought that would be the end of it, and for the most part it was. Until I got a call from a local news station. They had seen the viral footage and wanted to do a feel-good story about my property, the helicopters, and the unexpected showdown between private rights and public entitlement. I agreed on one condition, that I got to tell my side exactly as it happened. When the segment aired, it exploded. The story was framed as small-town man stands up to wedding invasion. They even showed clips of the helicopter footage and the shredded wedding tent flapping in the wind. Karen was never mentioned by name, but anyone who had seen the memes knew who she was. The best part came a week later when a tourism magazine reached out to the helicopter company for an interview. They asked if they could feature the property in an article about unique flight experiences. The pilot told me he'd offered them a quote about the most memorable landing he'd ever done and how it involved dodging lace umbrellas and airborne shrimp cocktail. I laughed until my sides hurt. But the icing on the cake was something I didn't expect. One of the guests from the wedding, an older gentleman who had taken one of the joyrides, sent me a handwritten thank you letter. He said it was the most exciting day of his life, and that the view from the sky made him feel young again. He even enclosed a check for $200 as thanks. I framed the letter. Karen had tried to hijack my land for her fantasy wedding. Instead, she created a viral disaster that ended in citations, legal threats, unpaid bills, and public mockery. But for me, it had turned into something more. Proof that boundaries matter. That facts win. And that sometimes the universe fights back, not with words or arguments, but with spinning blades and 40-mile-per-hour winds. Just when I thought the final chapter of this ridiculous saga had been written and closed, another unexpected twist came whirling back into my life. About 2 weeks after the viral video had taken over the internet and Karen had gone silent on every known platform, I received a certified letter in the mail that made me double over in disbelief. It wasn't from Karen directly, but from a firm that claimed to represent her. The letter, soaked in legal jargon and arrogance, demanded I issue a public apology, compensate Karen for trauma, cover the full cost of her failed wedding, and immediately cease all helicopter-related activities on the property. Reading it felt like trying to digest a bedtime story written by someone high on glitter and self-delusion. They used terms like psychological sabotage, deliberate emotional infliction, and wrongful aviation conduct. The most outrageous part was a clause demanding that I pay for a full wedding redo at a venue of her choice, complete with transportation for all guests and premium lodging. I read the letter twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I scanned it, emailed it to Amy, and called her. She didn't answer with a hello but with a long sigh and a sarcastic "here we go again." She told me to sit tight while she drafted a response that would not only dismantle the claims but send a clear message that the joke had gone on long enough. In her reply, Amy included copies of all documentation again, a summary of the citations issued to Karen by the sheriff, screenshots of the planner's messages, and a list of damages Karen caused while trespassing. At the bottom, she included a clause of her own. Either they drop all further legal pursuit and issue a written apology, or we file a countersuit for harassment, false claims, and interference with business operations. That ended the conversation very quickly. 3 days later, I received a brief, one-line email from Karen's law firm. It read, "We no longer represent the client in question." I chuckled and moved on with my day. But if Karen had finally understood the consequences of her actions, the rest of the internet certainly had not forgotten her. Memes continued to flourish. One particularly clever person created a parody wedding invitation that read, "Join us for the wedding of the century," featuring sudden gusts of wind, rotating cake platforms, and unscheduled flyovers. Another person stitched together a compilation of wedding fails and added Karen's video as the grand finale. That video alone passed 10 million views within a week. A wedding photographer who'd worked at the event finally spoke up too. He posted a blog titled "When Brides Go Rogue" and included anonymized photos of the aftermath: the blown-over tables, the muddy heels, the floating arch fragments in the pond. His caption read, "I've seen beach weddings, barn weddings, and even a llama wedding, but nothing prepared me for the helicopter wedding." But while the online world cackled and shared, something else started happening. A growing number of people began reaching out to the helicopter company requesting flights to the infamous landing zone. Apparently, the viral fame had turned my field into an oddball tourist destination. Some customers wanted to see where the veil took flight. Others asked if we offered reenactment. It was surreal. What started as a nightmare trespassing incident had now become a side hustle. The helicopter company leaned into the attention. They added a new flight package called the Bridal Gust Tour, complete with commentary about the events that took place on that day. They even started letting passengers toss faux bouquets from the air for laughs. I couldn't believe it. It was like my lawn had become a theme park. I got a cut of every flight, of course, which only made the situation funnier. And it wasn't just casual tourists either. Reporters showed up wanting interviews. A documentary crew asked to do a short feature on viral property dispute. A podcast host interviewed me about what it's like to become accidentally internet famous because someone tried to marry themselves to your land. I kept thinking surely this would all die down. But instead, it kept picking up. People started sending me mail. One envelope included a crumpled invitation with a note that read, "Thanks for reminding me to actually book my venue next time." Another envelope had a keychain shaped like a helicopter and a thank you note from a couple who canceled their backyard wedding after watching the video. One even included a Starbucks gift card and a note saying, "You deserve this after surviving airborne Karen." And then came the strangest request of all. A man emailed me asking if he could propose to his girlfriend on my lawn, under the exact arch where Karen's had blown away. He thought it would be ironic and unforgettable. I told him sure, as long as he didn't block any choppers or bring anyone named Karen. He laughed and promised to follow the rules. They flew in that weekend. I watched from the porch as he got down on one knee in the middle of the field. The proposal went perfectly. No drama, no wind gusts. Just a simple yes and two people walking off the field hand in hand. As they left, the woman waved and shouted, "This place has way better vibes than TikTok said." I smiled and waved back. All this chaos had somehow reshaped the purpose of my quiet property. A place that had once been peaceful and untouched now buzzed with activity, but in the best way. Tourists came and went, proposals happened, and a strange little legend had been born. It reminded me how quickly life can shift from peaceful to insane, and then, if you lean into it, back to meaningful again. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy some poetic justice too. One of the news outlets released a follow-up story revealing that Karen and her now ex-fiancé had officially split. According to unnamed sources, the groom had been embarrassed by her behavior, her refusal to apologize, and the social media circus she created afterward. He'd moved out within days of the wedding disaster and had returned the ring. Some outlets speculated that the whole incident had caused him to rethink his entire relationship. I couldn't confirm any of that, but I will admit I wasn't surprised. Entitlement might crash a wedding, but it's not strong enough to hold together a marriage. Toward the end of the month, I decided to mark the occasion by putting up a new sign at the front of my property. It was hand-carved, made of reclaimed wood, and mounted on 2 tall posts. It read "No trespassing, active helicopter landing zone, wedding reenactments start at 3 p.m. Saturdays." I added a little chopper icon at the bottom for good measure. It was both a warning and a tribute. Every time a new visitor read it, they'd chuckle or ask questions. Some took pictures with it. Others stood quietly as the blades of the next helicopter approached in the distance, creating that familiar whirring rhythm in the air. What had started with an uninvited bride and a pile of folding chairs ended in one of the most unexpected and strangely fulfilling chapters of my life. And as I stood on that porch again watching the wind dance across the grass, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or angry. Sometimes it's letting the world see someone's actions in daylight, then stepping back and letting the propellers do the rest. The weeks rolled by, and the chaos gradually melted into a kind of legendary calm. The field returned to its usual routine, helicopters coming in like clockwork, pilots chatting between landings, and the occasional tourist snapping selfies beside the now iconic signpost. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it, but the universe, in its infinite sense of irony, had one last encore to deliver. One bright Saturday morning, as I sat on the porch with my usual mug of coffee, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A car I didn't recognize pulled up slowly. It was a rental, something modest, with out-of-state plates. I stood up, expecting another curious tourist, but what stepped out made my jaw tighten. Karen's mother. I had seen her in some of the wedding footage. Her hair perfectly styled, her dress expensive, her face permanently fixed in an expression of annoyed elegance. She walked up with measured steps, holding a purse like it was an accessory in a courtroom drama. I debated whether to turn and go back inside, but curiosity pinned me in place. She introduced herself politely, almost stiffly, and then asked if she could speak with me for a few minutes. Against better judgment, I nodded. We sat down on the edge of the porch steps, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice that carried exhaustion more than anger, she admitted she had come to apologize. Not on behalf of Karen, but on her own. She said she hadn't known the full story, only Karen's version at first, and that it had taken weeks for her to piece together what really happened. She said she had been horrified when she saw the drone footage, even more so when she saw her own behavior on camera. I had forgotten that part. Apparently, she had been the one barking at the caterers and demanding they use my garden hose to fill champagne buckets. She admitted that the embarrassment had fractured her relationship with her daughter, that Karen still refused to take responsibility and had become even more defensive since the fallout. Her mother, on the other hand, said she had done a lot of reflecting. She told me she'd grown up believing that if you acted confident enough, you could get away with anything. That entitlement was a form of survival. But now she wasn't so sure. She said watching it all blow up, literally, had been a humbling experience. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was wary. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only acknowledgement. And that I could offer. We shook hands, and she left without asking for photos or favors or a second chance. It felt like closure, even if it wasn't the neat kind you expect. That same afternoon, I got a call from the helicopter company. They told me something wild had happened. Apparently, a celebrity, an A-list actor known for his wild sense of humor and offbeat Instagram posts, had shared the viral wedding video with the caption, "If I ever get married again, it's happening here." That one post sent the internet ablaze all over again. Thousands of new eyes landed on the story. Old videos resurfaced. People started booking flights months in advance, just for a chance to land where the chaos happened. The field had become folklore. The actor didn't actually come out himself, but his fans did. Some drove hundreds of miles. One couple came in full wedding attire and reenacted the Karen meltdown as performance art. They laughed, posed for pictures under a fake arch, then left without leaving a trace. No mess, no drama. Just fun. The town started catching on too. The local diner added a menu item called Karen's Cake Disaster, vanilla crumble with whipped topping and sugar shards shaped like tent poles. A nearby gift shop started selling mini toy helicopters with pop-up veils. Even the mayor got in on the joke, asking me if I'd ever consider turning the land into an official event space. I politely declined. The novelty was fun, but I liked things simple. Besides, chaos didn't need to be encouraged. It had a way of finding me on its own. But there was one thing I did decide to do. With the money I'd made from increased tourism, media royalties, and new lease agreements, I put together a small local fund. It wasn't flashy. It helped pay for equipment for the volunteer fire department, supported a school field trip program, and fixed up the old community center roof. I didn't announce it publicly. Just did it. Quietly. The town noticed. One evening, a group of local business owners came to visit with a framed certificate they'd made themselves. It was simple, laminated, and spelled my name wrong, but it read in huge letters Air Traffic Controller of Chaos and Community. I hung it in my shed with pride. The biggest surprise of all came when I received a letter from the FAA. Not a warning or a violation notice, but a formal acknowledgement of my cooperation and documentation during the viral incident. They even included a statement thanking me for maintaining airspace integrity during an unscheduled civilian intrusion. That went in a frame too. I sometimes wondered what had happened to Karen. From the little I gathered through whispers and second-hand accounts, she'd moved back in with relatives and was apparently trying to pivot into an influencer role focused on healing after betrayal. Her new content involved inspirational quotes and filtered selfies with captions about rising from ashes and regaining control. The irony didn't escape me. But I didn't waste time thinking about her. She had become background noise in a story far bigger and better than her tantrum. The story had become about resilience, laughter, and the weird, beautiful way strangers could rally around a moment of ridiculousness and turn it into connection. One Saturday near the end of the season, as the sun dipped low and the last helicopter for the day lifted off into the golden light, I sat in my porch swing with a fresh cup of coffee and just watched. The wind brushed through the grass in gentle waves. The noise of the rotors slowly faded until all that remained was the soft chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. My field had seen chaos, seen drama, seen embarrassment and comedy and unexpected fame. But now, in this quiet evening glow, it had returned to what it always was. A space that was mine. A space that had weathered storms both literal and emotional. And a space that reminded me, every time a shadow passed over it from above, that sometimes the best stories are the ones you never saw coming. I got up, stretched, and walked the short distance to the wooden sign at the edge of the property. I brushed some dust off it and smiled at the words. Private land. Helicopters welcome. Weddings not recommended. And just beneath that, someone had scrawled a message in permanent marker. Best plot twist of the year. I left it there. It felt right.